Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you how to take a discussion-based lesson plan that you've been teaching in a face-to-face format and move it and transform it so that it suits a synchronous Zoom-based format, right? And while it might be easy to think, oh, but I can just do the things that I do in the classroom over Zoom, it doesn't really work that way. We want to make sure that we're accounting for the fact that interacting in a digital space like Zoom, even though video chat can mostly, approximate face-to-face interaction, that there is a difference. It feels different to students, it feels different to instructors. Simple things like writing on a whiteboard or showing slides become a little bit more complicated, right? So I'm going to show you how to take a face-to-face discussion-based class lesson plan that I teach every semester in my own courses and convert it into a synchronous Zoom lesson, okay? So what does the sample lesson plan look when I teach it in a face-to-face format? The lesson is called Fables as Arguments, and the goal is basically to get students to recognize that stories use very specific tools in order to create and convey meaning to readers, all right? Or viewers for that matter. So the learning objectives are that students explore how creators use narrative techniques to send messages. The students differentiate between intended and unintended messages, right? For example, the intended message of Beauty and the Beast is don't judge a book by its cover. Unintended messages might be, that it's okay to lock someone in a castle and wait for them to fall in love with you. Another learning objective is students practice their basic analysis techniques that they're going to use later in the course. And I also do a soft introduction of ideas like context and how it affects meaning and audience. So for example, the fact that Little Red Riding Hood has one meaning when we read it today, right? Don't stray from the path, little girl. But if you know that in the time it was written that wolves were often symbols of sexually predatory men, that the meaning becomes quite different, right? No longer do as you're told, don't stray from the path, becomes this sort of prohibition against sex and sexuality and put the burden of women to guard their own sexual purity. And the idea of audience that depending on who's watching, for example, a movie, the message might feel different, right? Students often think of Finding Nemo, right? And the moment when Nemo swims out into the water and touches the boat in defiance of his father, right? And then is captured by a diver. Children might watch that scene and think, ah, yes, Nemo disobeyed his dad and was captured by a diver. Thus, listen to your parents. But parents watching that scene might connect the ways that Nemo is rebelling because Marlin has been sort of over-parenting Nemo, right? Being sort of oppressive and stifling. And so Nemo is acting out, right? So instead, the message becomes one about allowing children to have a certain amount of freedom, right? And recognizing that you can't protect them from everything. So those are the learning objectives that I'm shooting to get at in this course. The structure in a normal face-to-face format goes as follows. It starts with an interactive lecture. What are fables? How do they work? Usually I write what is a fable on the board. The students all sort of stare at me. I go, can you think of an example? And oftentimes one of them will raise their hand and go, tortoise and the hare, I think. And I go, yes. And from there we try to build out what a fable is, how it works, how it creates meaning. Then I put them in small groups to apply that fable framework to familiar stories, right? They often choose Finding Nemo, Beauty and the Beast, Shrek is another common one. They might choose Harry Potter or The Hunger Games, right? They just have to pick a story that everyone in the group is familiar with and think about it in terms of a fable. And this helps them really connect with their classmates and start to form that class community. Then we discuss as a big group. Each small group talks about what story they talked about and what meaning they think it's making, what messages it's sending by thinking about it as a fable. Then we watch this sort of goofy German Christmas commercial in which the sort of patriarch of a family, the grandfather, is all alone in his house year after year for Christmas, and his 3 children who are living off in far-flung places keep calling saying, oh, sorry, Dad, I can't come this year. And so the grandfather fakes his own death in order to get the 3 children to come back home for Christmas. And it ends with this sort of, very warm and fuzzy scene of them all at the dinner table. And then they get back into small groups and they talk about this story as a fable, right? What messages is it sending? What are its intended and unintended messages? How is it making meaning? And then we come back and we discuss, right? We talk about, intended message is that family is important. Unintended message that it's okay to lie and cheat and scare the living bejesus out of your family members in order to get them to come together, right? A sort of ends justifies the means kind of argument. So we talk through that as a big group. Okay, so that's how the lesson plan goes in a sort of conventional face-to-face setup. So now I'm going to show you how I would do it in a synchronous Zoom lesson. And to do that, I have to get out of PowerPoint and open Zoom. And obviously this is going to be a little bit of an approximation because it's only me on the Zoom meeting, right? So I'm going to start the meeting. There I am. All right. And normally I would start this by doing, once again, the interactive lecture. And to make this extra interactive, I would do it using the whiteboard function in Zoom. So I'm going to show you how to do that. You go share screen, then you get up all these options, right? I'm going to click whiteboard, share. And then this will pop up, right? And if you were doing this with a bunch of students, they would see this as well. And with a whiteboard, you can select text, right? And then I could put things below it, you know, like animal characters, right? That's one of the characteristics of a fable. And I could go on from there, right? I can also draw things. I'm not very proficient with these sorts of tools. I can click a stamp, right? I can erase things, I can undo, and I can clear all. I can also save, right? So say I have a whole, outline of what a fable is and all our class notes up on here. I can save that, either to put online for a student who was absent or another to just store it for my records. Another fun thing with this is that if you want to make it really interactive and say have students brainstorm on the whiteboard before you kind of get into the lecture portion, they can actually write on this whiteboard too. Okay, so if I go here, the automatic setting is that everyone can write on the whiteboard. So actually, if you only want it to be you, the instructor, writing on the whiteboard, go disable attendee annotation, right? And that'll make it so that only you can write on it. Say that you've been, I'm still in stamp function. Say that you've been writing on this for a while in your course, right, as a collaborative lecture, and you want to add another page, you just go down here to this little plus, and then you can move back and forth, right? So say I wanted to have students brainstorm on this page, right? I could do that here. And I could keep their brainstorming separate from their big notes that we're doing all together as a class, right, as part of the more formal lecture portion. All right, so I would use this and really like I would a conventional whiteboard, right, where sometimes I'm having students write up there, sometimes it's just me sort of organizing the ideas that they're putting out, right, into this interactive lecture about what fables are, right, and then I would save it at the end so that I could post it for students who are absent, okay? So I'm going to stop share now. All right, so say we got through the interactive lecture, then I would put them in breakout rooms, okay? And you can have them automatically sort into breakout rooms, and that is really the easiest thing for Zoom because it does it fairly quickly, right? I do want to encourage you to use the manual setting, even though it takes a second and can kind of feel like it's mucking up the rhythm of a class, because the pedagogical research says that if you give students a little bit more sense of consistency in who they're working with in those smaller cohorts, that it can increase their sense of community in the class, which is obviously harder to create online than it is face-to-face, right? So using those smaller cohorts and giving them consistency so that students are meeting with the same people for, say, 2 or 3 weeks of the class before you switch it up, right, can give them a stronger sense of connection to their peers and to the broader class community. So that would mean that when you do breakout rooms, have it be manual, right, and then you can sort participants into each room. And like I said, it is a little bit time-consuming for a second, especially before you get the knack for it. But if you have sort of either in a Word document or in your head who you're going to put with what, it doesn't have to take too long. All right, so I would put them in their breakout room groups, and they would do the portion where they take a story that they're all familiar with and apply the fable framework to it, rather. And as they do that, I can pop in between breakout rooms, right? And that would show up as a little side panel on my Zoom, and I could hit join breakout room and then leave breakout room, right? To sort of move through and see what the various groups are talking about. And then we would have our big discussion where we would come back together, right? And start drawing connections between all the stories that they talk about. And then I would show them this funky German commercial, right? And I would do that by pulling up my web browser. I would already have this prepped. Here it is, right? So I would pull up the commercial, and then as soon as it loads, maybe I could go back to share screen, and now I can select this.
Hallo Papa, ich bin's.
Right? So now we're all watching this kind of goofy German Christmas commercial. All right? Now, here's where I would start to do the lesson plan in a more sort of markedly different way than I do it face-to-face. So one of the things you have to remember is that when students are operating online, their sort of stamina for how long they can stay active and engaged is much lower. Think of it, in the way that for us faculty, we can stay engaged in an hour-long face-to-face meeting easier than we can stay engaged in an hour-long Zoom meeting, right? Partially because the temptation to, check email or whatever is just so strong and so easy to do, partially just because that digital medium is just harder for people to stay active in for the most part. So as I move through this lesson and get later and later in the lesson, I'm going to make it more active and interactive to make sure that they're staying engaged, recognizing that it's going to be harder for them to stay engaged unless I'm really facilitating it. So for example, in the original lesson plan, after watching the commercial, I just put them back in their groups and they discuss. What I'm going to do this time is put them back in those same breakout room groups, and instead of just discussing what they think the messages of the German Christmas commercial are, according when we think about it as a fable, they're actually going to make a PowerPoint slide that they can then share their screen to the whole class, and they can sort of report out their ideas. Having something tangible that they have to show people and maybe even turn in keeps that engagement level up, right? Where otherwise they might just sort of stumble through the discussion questions or not really talk about it very much at all. Having something that they have to present to the room, make sure that they're staying engaged and sort of staves off some of that negative inertia that comes in the back half of a Zoom lesson, right? So remember that trick of making the lesson more active the longer you go in a Zoom lesson, yeah? And then I would once again bring it back out to the big group discussion and have each of them share their screen to show that PowerPoint slide. And by the way, to do that, you want to make sure that they are able to do that. So you want to go to share screen, this little arrow to the right of the share screen button, go advanced sharing options, and make sure that all participants can share their screen, right? And that way they can share those PowerPoint slides that they've created in order to keep that active learning up. All right, thank you. And I've got another video in which I convert this lesson into a asynchronous icon-based lesson and also into a blended format that takes elements of both asynchronous and synchronous and combines them together. So if you're interested in the best practices for those teaching formats, make sure you check out those other videos. Thanks.